December 23, 1944, the forest east of Bastogne. For 6 days, the German offensive that Hitler has staked the last operational reserves of the Wehrmacht upon has been advancing through the Ardennes on a timetable that assumed the weather would keep Allied aircraft grounded and assumed that American infantry divisions, thinly spread along what had been considered a quiet sector, would break the way American divisions broke at Kasserine 2 years earlier. Neither assumption is holding, and on this morning, in the fields and tree lines surrounding the American perimeter at Bastogne, German infantry advancing under artillery cover that has worked, in every previous campaign of the war, exactly the way German infantry doctrine expects it to work, are encountering something that the after-action reports filed in the following days will describe with a specific and puzzled precision. The American shells are not landing. They are exploding in the air. The German infantry moving forward in the standard dispersed formation that 4 years of Eastern Front experience has taught every surviving officer to use against ground-burst artillery, are finding that the formation does not help. A soldier who has learned, through hard experience, to read the whistle of an incoming shell and throw himself flat in the nearest depression before the round strikes the earth, is finding that the round is not striking the earth. It is detonating 20 meters above his head, and the depression that would have protected him from a ground burst is doing nothing against a burst that showers its fragments downward into precisely the terrain features that ground burst doctrine has trained him to trust. The casualty reports moving back through German medical channels in the days after Christmas are describing wound patterns that regimental surgeons have not seen in this concentration before, and the officers compiling the reports that will eventually reach Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B headquarters are using a term that has not, until this week, appeared with any frequency in German artillery assessments of the American Army. Airburst, not occasional airburst, the kind any artillery produces when a fuse malfunctions or a round clips a treetop. Airburst as a deliberate, universal, first-round characteristic of the shells the American batteries around Bastogne are firing. The immediate tactical picture that Model is receiving in the last week of December 1944 is a picture that does not fit inside the intelligence assessment his staff has been working from since the offensive's planning began in the autumn. That assessment, built from 4 years of German experience fighting American artillery in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, has treated American gunnery as competent, well-supplied, and tactically unremarkable in the specific sense that matters to an attacking infantry commander. American guns fire accurately. American guns fire in volume that German artillery, its own production strained by two-front attrition, has struggled to match since 1943. But American shells, in every engagement German intelligence has documented before this week, behave the way artillery shells have behaved since indirect fire became the dominant form of land warfare in the First World War. They strike the ground, or a structure, or a vehicle, and they detonate on contact. And the infantry doctrine every European army has spent a generation refining is built around defeating exactly that kind of detonation. What Model's forward commanders are describing to him now is a shell that detonates before contact, on a timing so consistent across so many rounds from so many different batteries that it cannot be attributed to fuse variation or manufacturing inconsistency. It is behaving as though it knows, with a precision no mechanical timer has previously achieved, exactly how far above the ground it is. Walter Model's career by December 1944 has made him, in the specific and narrow professional sense that matters to understanding how he receives this report, the German officer least likely among Hitler's remaining senior commanders to be intellectually unsettled by an unfamiliar battlefield phenomenon and most likely to demand, immediately and specifically, an explanation his staff can act on rather than merely register. Model has built his entire reputation, since his transfer to the Eastern Front in 1941, on a professional identity that other German generals, many of them products of the aristocratic officer corps that produced Rundstedt and Manstein, regard with a mixture of respect and faint distaste. He is not a theorist. He did not write the doctrinal texts that Guderian wrote before the war, and he does not carry the family names that give men like Manstein and Rundstedt their standing within the Wehrmacht's internal hierarchy of prestige. What Model carries instead is a documented record, repeated across 4 increasingly desperate command assignments between 1941 and 1944, of arriving at a collapsing front and stabilizing it through a combination of tactical improvisation, ruthless personal intervention at the lowest levels of command, and a willingness to argue directly with Hitler that few other generals of his rank have demonstrated and survived. He commanded the Ninth Army during the winter crisis before Moscow in December 1941, the same crisis that ended Guderian's career, and where Guderian was relieved for ordering the tactical withdrawals his professional judgment demanded. Model achieved comparable withdrawals and comparable stabilization through a personal relationship with Hitler built on results rather than theory, a relationship that let him argue for operational flexibility in ways that cost other generals their commands. He commanded at Rzhev through 1942 and early 1943, holding a salient against Soviet pressure that consumed Soviet manpower at a ratio favorable enough to earn him, from his own staff and eventually from Hitler personally, the nickname that would follow him for the rest of the war: the Führer's Fireman. The general sent to whichever sector of the front was currently burning, with the specific and understood expectation that he would arrive, assess the collapse with an engineer's rather than a theorist's eye, and produce a defensive solution built from whatever forces and terrain were actually available, rather than from what doctrine specified should be available. By the summer of 1944, this reputation has made Model the obvious choice for the 2 assignments that define his final year of the war and that place him, by December, in direct command of the forces attempting to execute Hitler's Ardennes offensive. In June, following the collapse of Army Group Center in Belarus, a collapse so total that it destroys more German divisions in weeks than Stalingrad destroyed in months, Model is transferred east to stabilize a front that has, in the professional judgment of most general staff officers reviewing the situation maps, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent defensive line. He does, through methods that remain consistent with his Rzhev record, produce a stabilization that no other available commander is expected to have achieved. In August, with Army Group B collapsing in Normandy following the American breakout at Avranches and the encirclement forming at Falaise, Model is transferred west, arriving in France in time to manage the retreat from the Falaise pocket and the subsequent withdrawal across the Seine, a retreat that costs the German army enormous equipment losses, but that preserves, through Model's direct and repeated intervention in unit-level movement decisions, a larger fraction of the trained manpower than the encirclement scale would have predicted. It is this record, the specific and repeated demonstration of producing order from collapse through direct engagement with tactical reality rather than through appeals to doctrine, that makes Model the commander Hitler selects to oversee Army Group B's execution of the Ardennes offensive that begins on December 16, 1944. An offensive whose planning assumptions Model himself has argued against in staff conferences through the autumn, recommending a more limited operational objective than the drive to Antwerp that Hitler has personally specified, and being overruled in a pattern that has by this stage of the war become the standard experience of every German general whose professional judgment conflicts with the increasingly detached, strategic vision emanating from the Führer's headquarters. What this career has produced in Model, by the time the Airburst reports begin arriving from the forces around Bastogne, is a command style built around a specific professional habit that distinguishes him from officers like Rundstedt, whose approach to unfamiliar battlefield developments tends toward measured staff analysis conducted at some remove from the front. Model's habit, documented repeatedly by the staff officers who served under him at Rzhev and in Normandy, is to move to the location generating the anomalous report personally, to interrogate the officers filing it directly rather than through the filtered summaries that typically reach an Army Group commander, and to demand from his intelligence staff not a theoretical explanation of what might be happening, but an operational assessment of what the German infantry can do about it in the next 48 hours. This is the professional lens through which Model receives the Airburst reports in the week after Christmas 1944. And it is a lens that produces, within days, a level of institutional urgency about the phenomenon that a more theoretically minded commander might not have generated as quickly. The German intelligence assessment of American artillery fusing technology in the months leading into the Ardennes offensive has been built from sources that are, in the specific and limited way that has characterized German technical intelligence throughout the war, adequate to the assessment task German intelligence has previously needed to perform, and inadequate to the task this new American development actually requires. German ordnance officers have captured American artillery shells on numerous occasions since the Normandy landings, and the standard American mechanical time fuse, a fuse that requires a battery's fire control officer to calculate a precise time setting based on range and set the fuse accordingly before firing, is a piece of technology German intelligence understands completely, having fielded functionally similar mechanical time fuses in German artillery for years. What German intelligence has not previously encountered, because the American army has not previously deployed it over land, is a fuse that requires no such calculation. A fuse built around a miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit inside a standard artillery shell's nose, a device that broadcasts a continuous radio signal as the shell travels and measures the strength of the signal reflected back from the ground beneath it, detonating automatically at the precise altitude, consistently between 15 and 20 meters, that produces the maximum lethal fragment spread against unprotected infantry. This technology, developed by American and British scientists working under a security classification comparable to the Manhattan Project's own, has existed since 1942, but the American Navy and the combined chiefs of staff have restricted its use to anti-aircraft applications over water, specifically to defend against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific, precisely because of the fear that a single unexploded round falling into enemy hands over land would allow German or Japanese engineers to reverse engineer the miniaturized radio proximity fuse and deploy the same technology against Allied forces within a matter of months. It is only in mid-December 1944, as the Ardennes crisis develops and American commanders recognize the specific defensive value the technology offers against the mass infantry assaults the German offensive is employing, that the restriction is lifted for ground use, and the fuse, designated in American logistics documentation simply as the variable time fuse, reaches American artillery batteries in the Ardennes in the exact week that German infantry begins encountering its effects. The tactical mathematics of what the variable time fuse changes are once German ordnance officers begin analyzing captured duds in the days following its first use, mathematics that any trained artillery officer can reconstruct without difficulty. And it is this reconstruction, arriving at Model's headquarters in the final days of December, that produces the specific institutional alarm his subsequent communications to Army Group B's subordinate commands will reflect. A ground-burst shell, however accurately placed, produces a lethal fragment pattern that any infantryman trained to seek the nearest depression in the ground can substantially survive, because the earth itself absorbs the majority of the blast's downward and lateral energy, and a soldier lying flat presents a minimal target to fragments traveling in a roughly horizontal plane from a ground-level detonation. An airburst shell detonating 15 meters overhead inverts this calculation entirely. The fragments travel downward across the entire area beneath the burst, and the foxhole, the depression, the prone position that has kept infantry alive against ground-burst artillery since the technology was invented, becomes not a partial protection but, in the specific geometry of a directly overhead airburst, almost no protection at all. German artillery doctrine, refined across 4 years of combat against the mechanical time fuses that both sides have used throughout the war, has never needed to solve this problem at scale, because achieving a consistent, reliable airburst at the optimal killing height has previously required either a skilled forward observer adjusting fire round by round against a fixed target, a slow and ammunition-intensive process unsuitable for the kind of mass defensive fire the Americans are now producing, or the kind of precisely calculated mechanical time fuse setting that requires exact knowledge of range and that fails routinely when the assumptions behind the calculation, atmospheric conditions, powder temperature, individual shell manufacturing tolerances, vary even slightly from the calculation's assumptions. The variable time fuse requires none of this. Every round, fired by any battery under any conditions against any target, detonates at approximately the same optimal height, with a first-round reliability that transforms what has previously been a specialized and difficult tactical achievement into the automatic, default behavior of ordinary artillery fire. The specific engagement that crystallizes this problem for Model's headquarters occurs in the days immediately following Christmas, as German infantry attempting to press the attack against the American perimeter at Bastogne encountered defensive artillery fire that after-action reports from surviving company commanders describe with a directness unusual in German military documentation, which typically favors the kind of measured, professionally neutral language that Model's own staff officers have been trained to use. The reports describe advancing infantry sections, spread in the doctrinal dispersed formation, designed to minimize casualties from ground-burst fire, being caught by airbursts that produce casualty rates the same officers describe as exceeding, in their direct professional experience, anything they encountered in comparable engagements on the Eastern Front against Soviet artillery, itself among the most feared arms of service in the entire war on either side. The specific detail that recurs across multiple independent reports reaching Model's headquarters through the final week of December is the observation that American gunners appear to require no adjustment fire at all, that the first salvo landing on a newly identified German position produces airbursts at the correct killing height without the ranging shots that every German gunner has been trained to expect and that every German infantry officer has been trained to use as a brief tactical warning. The seconds between a ranging round and the effective fire that follows it, during which experienced infantry can sometimes reposition before the accurate barrage arrives. That warning window, present in every artillery duel German infantry has fought in this war, is not present here. The first round is often the effective round, and infantry with no experience against this specific technology has no doctrinal basis for anticipating it. What moves up through the German command chain from the forward positions around Bastogne to Rommel's former Army Group B headquarters, now under Model's direct command, and eventually toward the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht assessment staff working, with diminishing coordination as the offensive's failure becomes apparent, to synthesize battlefield reports from a rapidly deteriorating strategic situation, is a body of tactical intelligence that Model's own communications treat with a specific urgency his staff officers will later describe. In post-war interrogations conducted by American and British intelligence teams cataloging the collapse of German military intelligence in the war's final months, as exceeding his usual register even for a commander known throughout the Wehrmacht for direct and often harsh communication with subordinate headquarters. Model's demand relayed through his intelligence staff to the artillery inspectorate and to whatever remained of the German ordnance evaluation apparatus by the final days of December 1944 is not for an explanation of the physics involved, a request his staff could not have satisfied in the available time regardless, but for an immediate assessment of whether German industry, in the collapsing production and transportation circumstances of the war's final winter, could replicate the technology in any time frame relevant to the battles Army Group B is currently fighting. The answer, delivered through channels that by this stage of the war are themselves fragmenting under the pressure of Allied bombing and the general administrative collapse accompanying Germany's shrinking strategic position, is that German industry possesses neither the specific radio miniaturization capability nor the production capacity to field a comparable Füze in any meaningful quantity before the war's end. An assessment that post-war technical intelligence reviews conducted by both American and British ordnance specialists confirm was substantially accurate. Germany's electronics industry, oriented for years toward different priorities and increasingly disrupted by strategic bombing of exactly the precision manufacturing facilities such a Füze would require, was simply not positioned to replicate American proximity Füze technology on any timeline that mattered to the war model. Was fighting in December 1944. The pattern that the Bastogne Airburst reports represent, when Model's staff and the broader German military intelligence apparatus attempt to place them in context during the war's final months, is a pattern that recurs, with escalating severity, across every subsequent engagement between German infantry and American or British artillery through the remainder of the European war. The technology's introduction at Bastogne is not an isolated tactical surprise, confined to a single battle, but the first documented instance of a capability that becomes, through the first months of 1945, standard equipment across increasing proportions of American and British artillery batteries operating in the European theater, precisely because the security restrictions that limited its earlier deployment have been lifted permanently once German forces demonstrate they cannot, within the war's remaining time frame, replicate or effectively counter it. German positions defending the Rhine crossings in March 1945, and subsequently the increasingly desperate defensive lines German forces attempt to establish inside Germany's own borders through the war's final 2 months, encounter variable-time Fuze artillery not as an occasional anomaly, but as the routine character of Allied indirect fire, a development that German infantry doctrine, already strained past its breaking point by the broader collapse of German military capability in early 1945, has no institutional mechanism to adapt to at the pace the war's remaining months demand. The specific soldiers who survive the Ardennes fighting and are later captured by advancing American forces, interrogated in the standard debriefing process, American and British intelligence conducted with prisoners throughout the war's final phase, describe the variable time Fuze in terms that intelligence officers compiling these interrogation reports flag repeatedly as exceeding the normal register of professional military assessment. Soldiers describing it not merely as an effective weapon but as a psychological development that altered, in ways ordinary artillery superiority had not previously altered, the basic tactical confidence infantry required to advance under fire at all. Walter Model does not survive to write the kind of retrospective military memoir that officers like Guderian produce in the years following the war, a fact that shapes, in a specific and important way, how the historical record of his professional assessment of the variable time Fuze and the broader pattern of American technical and industrial capability it represents has to be reconstructed. Model, refusing what he regards as the personal dishonor of formal surrender, takes his own life in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, in the final weeks of the war, as the army group he commands disintegrates under the combined pressure of encirclement and the total collapse of the broader German military position. What survives him, and what post-war Allied historical and intelligence teams working through captured German military records in the years immediately following the war's end are able to reconstruct, is not a memoir but a documentary record built from 3 separate sources that, taken together, allow historians a reconstruction of Model's professional assessment nearly as detailed as any surviving general's published recollections. The first source is Army Group B's own operational logs and situation reports, captured largely intact by advancing American forces in April 1945 and subsequently analyzed by the United States Army's Historical Division as part of the broader post-war project of documenting German military decision-making. The second source is the post-war interrogation record of Model's surviving staff officers, men who served under him through the Ardennes fighting and the subsequent retreat, and who were extensively debriefed by American and British intelligence teams specifically tasked with reconstructing German operational and technical assessments from the war's final year. The third source is the German Army's own ordnance evaluation correspondence, fragmentary but substantial, describing the specific technical assessment German engineers produced when analyzing captured American proximity-fused shells in the weeks following their first appearance at Bastogne. What these 3 sources converge upon, in a level of documented agreement that historians working through the captured German military archive consider unusually clear for a technical assessment conducted under the chaotic conditions of the war's final winter, is a judgment that Model's own communications to his subordinate commands express directly, and that his surviving staff officers, describing his reaction in post-war interrogation, consistently characterize in similar terms. The variable time Fuze represented, in Model's own operational assessment communicated to Army Group B's Artillery Inspectorate in the final days of December 1944, not merely a superior piece of ordnance technology, but a specific category of American industrial and scientific capability that German military planning had, in Model's direct phrasing as his staff officers later reconstructed, consistently and dangerously underestimated throughout the war's final 2 years. It was not, in the assessment his staff attribute to him, a weapon Germany had simply failed to develop through oversight or insufficient priority, a gap that a redirection of resources might have closed given time. It was a weapon built from a specific combination of miniaturized radio engineering, industrial production capacity, and the security discipline to keep the technology concealed for 2 years despite its obvious tactical value. A combination that German industry, strained by strategic bombing and years of resource allocation toward priorities that had not anticipated this specific technical direction, could not replicate regardless of how much priority German planning might now assign to the problem. This assessment, reconstructed from Model's operational communications and his staff's post-war testimony rather than from any memoir Model himself might have written, places him in a specific analytical position relative to the broader pattern of German intelligence failure that historians of the war's technical and industrial dimensions have subsequently identified across numerous separate cases. From the Sherman tank's operational effectiveness that German intelligence assessed inaccurately in Tunisia, to the broader question of American industrial mobilization that German economic planning consistently underestimated from the war's earliest years. What distinguishes the variable time Fuze case, and what Model's own communications specifically emphasize in a way that distinguishes his assessment from the broader and more diffuse German recognition of American industrial superiority, is the element of deliberate concealment. The Sherman's operational characteristics were, in principle, available to German intelligence throughout the war through captured examples and combat observation, and German intelligence's failure to correctly weight those characteristics was a failure of analytical framework rather than a failure of access to information. The variable time Fuze was different. It was a technology German intelligence had no meaningful access to at all, until the moment of its first battlefield use, deliberately withheld from any theater where a single captured dud might compromise it, and its sudden appearance at Bastogne represented not an intelligence assessment that had been available and misread, but an intelligence gap that had been, by deliberate American and British policy, total and unbridgeable until the specific tactical circumstances of the Ardennes crisis made the security cost of its continued concealment lower than the tactical cost of withholding it any longer. The broader lesson that Model's assessment, reconstructed through the documentary record his death prevented him from articulating in his own post-war voice, offers to any subsequent analysis of how military and industrial capability translates into battlefield outcome, is a lesson that extends considerably beyond the specific technical case of artillery fusing. It is a lesson about the relationship between visible and concealed capability in assessing an opponent's true military potential, and about the specific danger of building strategic and operational planning around an intelligence picture that, however accurate about what it can observe, has no mechanism for anticipating what an opponent has deliberately chosen not to reveal. German military intelligence through the war's final 2 years operated in case after case that historians have subsequently documented from an analytical framework built around observable indicators, tank specifications derived from captured examples, aircraft performance derived from combat encounters, industrial output estimated from available economic intelligence, and aerial reconnaissance of factory activity. This framework, whatever its individual technical sophistication, contained a structural blind spot that no amount of analytical refinement within the framework itself could correct, because the framework's entire operating assumption was that sufficient observation of an opponent's demonstrated capability would eventually produce an accurate picture of that opponent's true capability. The variable time Fuze demonstrates, with a clarity that Model's own staff communications capture even without the benefit of a post-war memoir to elaborate the point, that this assumption fails completely against an opponent with the specific combination of technical capacity and security discipline to develop and deploy a capability in complete concealment until the moment concealment no longer serves a purpose greater than deployment. What the Bastogne Airburst reports ultimately represent, in the specific analytical terms that Model's operational communications and his staff's subsequent testimony allow historians to reconstruct, is not primarily a story about a single item of ordnance technology, however tactically significant that technology proved across the war's final months. It is a story about the limits of any intelligence apparatus built to observe and extrapolate from an opponent's demonstrated behavior, when that opponent possesses both the industrial capacity to develop capabilities in advance of any operational necessity and the institutional discipline to conceal those capabilities until the specific moment of maximum tactical advantage. German military intelligence, across the full span of the European war, was frequently accurate about what American forces were currently doing, and frequently and systematically behind in anticipating what American industrial and scientific capacity was capable of producing next. A gap that reflected not a failure of any individual intelligence officer's competence, but a structural limitation in an intelligence methodology built around observed evidence attempting to assess an opponent whose most significant capabilities were, by deliberate design, withheld from observation until the precise moment observation no longer mattered. Walter Model, whose entire military career had been built around solving immediate tactical problems through direct engagement with observable battlefield reality rather than through the kind of long-range strategic theorizing that officers like Guderian practiced, found himself in the last winter of his life confronting a problem that no amount of tactical improvisation could solve. Because the problem was not a failure of German execution against a known threat, but a failure of German intelligence to know, until the threat was already falling from the sky above Bastogne, that the threat existed at all.